Welcome, Buttercups, to another live episode of Topic Discuss. I'm really excited for tonight. As usual, we're going to be speaking again with Mark Johnson, kind of through our series about his books that include things like the Tuesday Night Massacre and really what's happening today in kind of our democracy and how things are shaping out. I will warn you that you might hear my kids in the background or see them. I'm noticing that they're extra energetic today, so I apologize for that. And then also remember that if you're watching the show, to always slam the like button. And I am really excited because I think we have some special guests. I even think we might be hearing from Tiny's Kitchen and Crafts. So when we go live, or when we bring in our guests, we'll see what we can do with mentioning some special guests tonight. So I think we have our guests. I'll bring in Roger first. Roger, welcome.
Hey, Gary.
Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. And we will welcome Mark, our illustrious guest, who is the smartest amongst us.
Hi, Gary. Thanks for saying
Sorry.
that. I know it's not true, but thank you anyway. Hi, Roger.
Well, Mark, you're pretty smart. I don't know. I know you're smarter than I, but I don't know about Gary.
Yeah, you seemed offended a little bit, Roger, when I said that.
Well,
He's
in Mark's
sensitive.
case, it's true.
So I want to do a shout out, guys, to another YouTube channel that's here tonight, Tiny's Kitchen and Crafts. So my best friend that I went to high school with, Scott Scher, his daughter started a YouTube channel that is called Tiny's Kitchen and Crafts. So I wasn't expecting to see them joining us tonight. I never know who's going to join us tonight, but welcome to the Scher family, and make sure you guys hit that like button as we get started tonight. So I just want to kind of check in and see how your week has gone so far, guys, before we dive in.
Well, I've had a pretty good week. It's an absolutely gorgeous day here on the north coast of Oregon. Up mid to upper 50s, absolute bluebird sky and sunshine. So from that standpoint, life is very satisfying.
What's your weather like there, Roger?
I'm not going to talk about it. I did. So my week has been. I have my day job, and the semester has started at College of Eastern Idaho. So I this was my week of listening to the first presentations from my students. I teach a couple of sections of public speaking. So busy week. My tennis was canceled because one of our players got COVID. That we always play on Sunday, so it's still going on, and it's 24 degrees, overcast, with
Ooh.
a bit of sprinkly snow falling, and I am counting the days until we leave for the south for anywhere from 2 weeks to 5 years. I'm not sure how long it'll last.
Where south? Where south are you headed?
Well, so Gary, we're thinking actually about coming your way. We have a place we always go to in Ocean Beach, California, that we love, but I'm toying with the idea of expanding from 2 to 4 weeks because I need sun and I need air, and so we're thinking about coming to St. George and then expanding it to a 4 week stay, but still in process. Brad is helping me out there.
Well, if you are down here, we'll go to a lunch or a dinner and maybe bring Brad along. It'd be great to see.
Well, Brad can pay.
That's Brad can pay. That's right. He should. So a little bit about me this week. I'm starting tomorrow an adjunct faculty role at the university here, Utah Tech University in St. George, and I'll really just be teaching about scientific literacy and and critical thinking. And what might happen, just for the audience to know, is that we may, as a result, it's for seniors that are finishing their biology degrees. And as a result, some of them may have projects that have some controversial topics. If so, I think those students want to actually do interviews with me and maybe us, if you're open to it, on topic discussed. So we have a little following of students, of seniors over at the Science, Engineering, and Technology Center at the university. So that'll be fun.
Sounds great.
So for tonight's episode, I think there's some excitement around the title. I know from a few of our buttercups, and it's How Democracy Dies. And I noticed that when we were kind of putting this episode together, Roger mentioned, Mark, that you would do all the talking, and I think that will be great.
I'm not sure the audience would agree, Gary, but
No, I think they would. So I think the big question is, because again, I'm just going to kind of throw out the devil's advocate for me. I've heard from throughout my life different kind of family members who tend to be more conservative and maybe extreme right or very, very right. And every time a Democrat gets elected into the office of president, like Obama, I remember Obama being elected, and I hear from them, end of democracy. Or when we allowed China into the World Trade Organization, I hope my brother's watching because he may not remember this, but he told me that's the end of America. And now I think we're going to see the end of China, actually. So how do we talk about this tonight in terms of data and evidence to support, this question or our dialogue around what has really happened with our democracy that is so threatening? But to kind of lead into the discussion around, is it at risk of dying and how would it die? Is that okay?
sure.
So Mark, let's start with you. Like, how do we kind of gather, or what evidence is there, or what evidence do we look at to help us to kind of determine, is this just political rhetoric? Democracy is going to die now, or is there some evidence and data to show us that there's something systemically wrong going on?
Well, I think there's lots of evidence, Gary, and I'll be happy to give my take on some data points in just a second. But let me say at the outset, democracies die when essentially when two things happen. One, individual members of the democracy, voters, citizens, quit caring about the democratic process. And I mean that, small d democratic, not Democratic Party process, but the process of democracy, how a democracy works. And people, it's a messy system. I think we all agree with that. It takes too long sometimes to get to decisions, and the decisions are often not terribly satisfying. But when enough citizens give up on that process, then something else happens. Something has to take its place. And I think we're seeing some of that happening in the United States right now. So number one, individual citizens quit caring about the democratic process, believe that elections are rigged, that they're unfair, that one party or the other has a particular advantage that's baked in that doesn't reflect the society as a whole. So those are some of the things that I think are happening. The second thing is, democracy, like most of nature, abhors a vacuum. So when the democratic system doesn't seem to be working, or many people don't think it's working, then something has to step in and take that place. And I think typically what has happened when democracies have failed, at least in the last 100 years or so, it has been an autocrat who has stepped in and taken advantage of that situation, if you will. It certainly happened in European democracies in the 1920s and 30s. It's happened many times in Latin American pseudo-democracies where a strong man stepped in to, put things right for the population. So I think those are two examples of how democracies start to crumble. And if you want to take time now, I'll give you my three quick data points, and I think there are many more data points, but these seem to me to be particularly relevant at the moment. Since at least the 1840s in America, we've had the tradition of two political parties operating in rough parity. Sometimes one is up, sometimes another is up, sometimes one is up for a long period of time and the other is down. But generally, that has been the system that has worked for a long, long time to sustain American democracy. Two political parties competing over ideas and ideologies. The exception to when that didn't work was the 1850s, when the Democratic Party at that time was willing to see the country divided over the question of slavery. They were many Democrats, Southern Democrats in particular, Northern Democrats in some cases too, were willing to see the country dissolved over that question. So democracy truly broke down. They wouldn't accept the outcome of the election of 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected. Even before Lincoln was sworn in, many people forget this now, but even before he was sworn in March of 1861, several states had formally seceded from the Union. They were willing to see the country torn apart. So, but with that exception, and that's a huge exception to the norm, the two political parties have basically competed for a long, long time in the marketplace of ideas. So now I would argue you have one political party, the Democrats, far from faultless in their approach to politics or democracy, but they are proposing specific policy proposals related to everything from healthcare to climate change to voting rights, and you name it. I mean, we could go on with Democratic policy proposals. And they're trying to address in their own way what they see as the needs of the American population in those areas, competing for voters. The other political party didn't even write a platform in its last presidential campaign, and basically has become, I know it's easy to say this, but I think it's pretty demonstrable, has become a cult of personality, revolving around the last guy who held the Republican presidential office. So it's policy on the one hand, and we could debate, the wisdom of all of these Democratic policy proposals, but they are advancing policy proposals, as opposed to the other party, which either has been totally willing to embrace the Trumpian view of what politics ought to be in America, or you have people in the party who are so concerned that they can't get crosswise with that Trumpian vision that they've gone silent and they've gone to the sidelines, so to speak, in terms of participating. So the two political party process, I think, is breaking down or has broken down. Another quick example is this whole debate over voting right now. Again, you could argue about the specifics of what Democrats have proposed, and much of it needs to be argued over. But the fact is, Democrats have basically decided the future of the country lies in having as many people as possible who are eligible to vote actually have a reasonably easy opportunity to do that. Republicans have decided, I would argue, almost exactly the opposite. Make it more difficult, fewer people voting, erect as many barriers from the state level to the Congress as you can to make it more difficult to vote. That's a breakdown of the democratic system. There's been a rough agreement since at least 1965, when the Voting Rights Act passed, that both political parties believed that, the franchise, the ability to vote, was absolutely fundamental to democracy. One party doesn't believe that anymore. And the third thing, and this is probably the to me, the most frightening thing of all is the conservative movement in America right now has a militia problem.
Mhm.
They really do. You have these groups like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the followers of Ammon Bundy, who's a candidate for the Republican nomination for governor in Idaho right now. The estimates vary widely, but I actually talked to a reporter this week, Heath Drusen, public radio reporter who has done a lot of reporting on these groups, talked to many people who are involved in these militia groups. And he thinks there, are tens of thousands of these followers spread across the country who are ready to respond to a call to action. And we know they're armed to the teeth. The one thing Heath says that they absolutely believe in is uncontrolled access to weapons. So
Yeah.
that is a non-negotiable thing for these folks. Second thing that they generally agree about is that there's too much government. We ought to eliminate government interference in our lives at every level that we can possibly get to. And they're not above using intimidation tactics or even violence to achieve those objectives. So there's 3 data points for you about why I think democracy is in some serious trouble in America.
I
Let
love
me
it. Go ahead,
let me
Roger.
just throw in this thought. So I think I'm going to be the parenthetical commenter to Mark's thesis making, which is appropriate, I think. The actual existence and practice of democracy as we have defined it in our republic has been more the exception than the rule in our history. From 1865 to 1965, you had Jim Crow. And so many Americans were not given the privilege of participating in our democracy. It wasn't a small number. Of course, our Constitution formalized a lack of democracy in many respects. We all understand why those things happened, and we all understand that, most of us understand that the framers and founders were not perfect. But the fact is that, the 3/5 compromise and the belief that voters should be property owners, all of this sort of stuff has been around far longer than any practical implementation of true democracy across our country. So it really shouldn't come as a surprise or a shock that this experiment is always tenuous and always subject to a very lively contest. So that's why when you talk about this, it's not idle chit chat. Our history is rife with it.
I as I listen to what you're talking about, I can remember hearing in my own kind of conservative circles, friends, family, many years ago, 10, 20 years ago, kind of this, I always thought this very fringe movement, or I wouldn't even call it a movement, these fringe ideas that I thought were so crazy from people, in my world, that would talk about things like the need to that militias are the key to democracy, and that there are these kind of conspiracy theories that militias were done away with, and now we have this big enormous army, and so let's go back to the militia days. Only certain people should be voting. I've heard from some of these kind of ideologies that a true republic doesn't have everyone voting, and that's actually true. If you look at the Roman Republic that many of our forefathers were studying, it really did just leave voting to or participation to landowners. But I think that's what's so mind blowing to me still is that these fringe ideas, also Christian nationalism, right? That somehow there is a complete memory loss about the fact that our forefathers for this country really were trying to develop a secular government, not a religious government. That there was a very intentional move, to do that, and yet, now these kind of fringe groups want to rewrite that history and say, well, the intention was for it to be a Christian government, uh, but here we are today. These fringe ideologies really have not only taken root in the Republican Party, but they are the Republican Party now. Is that true? That they are that is fully what the Republican Party has turned into?
I would argue in the main that's a correct statement. I think the caveat that I would apply, Gary, is that and not every Republican believes that, including somebody like a Mitt Romney, for example. I don't think he buys into much of the sort of Trumpian view of where the Republican Party ought to be going. Having said that, though, as I said earlier, I think a lot of those guys, political office holders, are really, really intimidated by the fact that this one-time fringe element seems to be not only in charge but in ascendancy, continuing to rise inside the party, and that's a different thing. When a faction inside of a political party is afraid to speak out against the direction the party is going, then something really serious is taking place. They're concerned not just about their political future, I believe. I think they're concerned about their physical well-being, in part because of these militia groups. I had this reporter, Heath Drusen. I'm going to plug his podcast. He has a new podcast called Extremely American, which he goes inside these militia groups to really try to understand what they're all about, what their aims are. He's a very good reporter, and I think very fair with them in terms of letting them talk about what it is they're trying to do. But he said one thing that he really noticed when he first started covering these groups in Idaho was that you would see these guys show up periodically in the state capitol building, for example, open carrying a weapon inside of a government building, basically to make a statement that they could do that they were there, they had to be reckoned with. He said, now you go to the state capitol in Boise, or, there was an incident in Oregon where a bunch of these folks essentially improperly, illegally accessed the state capitol when it was shut down during a legislative session. And they're going into legislators' offices and they're demanding action on particular pieces of legislation, or to have a piece of legislation structured in some way that is that they think is appropriate. So that's different. I think that is really unusual. Roger, we always had these fringe players. I think it was Theodore Roosevelt who labeled them the lunatic fringe. That there's always been that element in our politics, but now they really do seem to continue to be on the ascendancy inside the conservative movement.
We have legislators in Idaho who open carry. It's not, it's, and I've been in Arizona where it's very, the holster and gun in the restaurants is just very commonplace in many communities in Arizona, and to a lesser degree in Idaho. So I just want to mention one thing. My sister Kathleen, who is here participating on the comments, reminds me women didn't have the right to vote until 100 years ago. So half of our population was, if you think about it, significantly more than half of our population for the majority of our history has not had the right to vote. If that's not, keeping people from democracy, then there is no definition for it. So, but I think Mark's right that there is I mean, I'm always cautious about being alarmist and overstating or but I don't think this is overstating anything. I think there is a different sense about what's going on just now, and I do think it's been enabled by the emergence of one person, but it's always been boiling up. It's always been seething just underneath the surface. I do think that social media and other ways of communicating are enabling it in a way that hasn't ever been available to that group before. So it's different.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, another data point really is, like you said, Mark, there is no Republican platform today. I can remember, really one thing I thought I liked about the Republican Party as a younger person is that, government or minimizing government intervention, and also keeping politics as local as possible. And yet in Utah, in my area, like in St. George, there's a Utah State Representative, Walt Brooks, who put forth legislation right now. It's in legislative session to ban employers from requiring employees to be vaccinated, including private employers. So hospitals could not require their employees to be vaccinated. He's fine with us requiring that we can't hire smokers or you can't smoke on campus. He's fine with that, but wants legislation that actually prevents a private business from doing something. We
Gary,
also have a legislature that's overturning local mask mandates. Go ahead, Roger.
I was just going to say, here's a more absurd example in Idaho. Years ago, not that many years ago, the Idaho State Legislature passed a law that is still in effect, prohibiting grocery stores from not using plastic bags. It is a law in Idaho that you must give customers in your grocery store the opportunity to use a plastic bag. And we can, it's not worth discussing, but that's the level of, local control is fine until it's not.
Right. So the other data point I want to bring up here, Mark,
I lost the sound there.
no.
You're back.
Yeah.
Mark, while we're waiting for Gary, you're familiar with the book, The 11 Nations of North America?
I am.
So the theory or the thesis behind that is, that if you were to take North America, including a section of Mexico, and divide it based on culture and politics and demography and such things, that it's actually 11 different countries. What do you think of that, and does it relate to what we're talking about?
Oh, I think it definitely does. This movement, if that's the right word for it, to have the easternmost portions, southernmost portions of Oregon separated off to join greater Idaho, I think speaks to that very idea that there's a cultural sorting, a ideological sorting that has long been a fixture of American politics, and in some ways it may be accelerating. So yeah, I think there's something to that theory that people sort themselves regionally, and where it breaks down a little bit maybe is in the metropolitan areas within those larger geographic regions where tend to be more progressive, liberal thinking people congregating. The Boise's in the middle of a ruby red Idaho or Salt Lake in the middle of very conservative Utah. So, but the larger point is, yeah, I think there's something to be said for that.
So I'm sorry I got cut off. I've got to work on my streaming capabilities, so I apologize for that. But
Gary, can I just quickly say one other thing I that I've personally noticed at the local level in politics, and it strikes me as being something that, again, I wasn't aware of, maybe if it were happening before, but certainly seems to be happening now. And this is down to the level of local units of government, city councils, county commissioners, school boards. If your side loses a debate over some policy at that level, many people are unwilling to accept that verdict of the Democratic process. So they're going to show up and protest at school board members' homes. They're going to, do all kinds of things to disrupt the process. It's not enough to to make your case, argue your point of view, have a vote and lose, and you figure out, well, I'll come back next time and be better organized and have better arguments, and maybe I'll prevail next time. Now the attitude seems to be, if I lose, the people who made the decision that cost me the loss are illegitimate. They're not, they're not worthy of our respect. They're not worthy of our support. And that's a very dangerous thing when that happens all the way down, so to speak, to the bottom of the democratic process.
I started covering city councils as a reporter in 1983, and so I've been intimately following them ever since. And I agree with you that sense of we won't accept the representation of our city council if we don't like its outcomes is, I've never seen anything like it. And another interesting sort of example of this extreme local bent is in Bonneville County, the home county of Idaho Falls. We have the Bonneville Central Committee, the Republican Committee, which is the ironically named Bonneville Central Committee, is made up of all fringe right-wing members, and they have successfully pushed out all the moderates from their, and they are so right-wing that they have been essentially they're ignored at the state level by the state party, which in Idaho is going some, but they have been able to get some of their candidates through and elected, because all you have to do in Idaho is get through the primary. And so they have some impact. They have not had impact, interestingly, in the city council. They've had one of their members get through for one term, and then she ran for mayor and got creamed, and sort of she's still in the state legislature. But so I think you're exactly right. I will mention that my sister Kathleen, who lives in Peru, Indiana, our hometown, is a member of the city council there, and the stories she could tell will just.
I think she just gave us a comment there. Because I voted against the Republican mayor, the local and state Republican Party has gone after me and are attempting to disavow me. You basically get kicked out, right? Which goes back to kind of this. I like a couple of things that you've said in this episode, Mark, and last episode. You've said this about religion and politics, that in our democracy in the United States, what we've attempted to do is create a marketplace of ideas that you compete for, right? And when you lose the competition, you either, like what you're supposed to do when you lose a competition is figure out how to get better, right? And improve your game. But what's happening right now is a bunch of sore losers, right? That they can't compete, they don't know how to compete. So they resort to violence. It feels like is kind of, or it's not the only thing they're resorting to,
or rig the
violence, or
rules.
you're
Rig
kicked
the
out.
rules. Yeah,
Yeah,
rig the
yeah.
rules to make sure that they don't lose the next time around. Yeah.
So speaking of breaking the rules, I think the data point I wanted to ask you about that I think, Roger, I appreciated you saying we don't want to be too catastrophic, but I want to peel apart this data point to see what objectivity there is there. So in the news, in current events, what we're learning about from January 6th of 21 is that, or even prior to that, so Trump's election loss, part of the GOP's strategy. So this is the GOP nationally and GOP in about 7 states had a plan to send fake electors to January 6th to submit these fake ballots. So Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, I think Michigan and Pennsylvania. There were 7 states, and that I want any Republican that might be paying attention to this video podcast to really think about at what point in our history does a party do something so blatantly dishonest and to truly, you've truly just unraveled our entire institutions, all our institutions that support our democracy. It did that, like, from a media literacy perspective, Roger, did that, how much do we know about whether that really happened, and what in the hell is the GOP thinking? Have we seen this
I
before?
think this supports Mark's data point, and I want him to go back to it. But as far as, here's the thing about media literacy: those of us who are trying to pay attention now are following the committee and reading the documents and are aware. But here's the thing: the people who need to know most about that are not paying attention to it. Are not following real journalism. They are not consuming real information, and so they don't know, or they don't care, or they don't want to know. And that's the issue that is frightening. The fact that they were emboldened to actually put a plan together is sort of stunning. The fact that a lot of people are just shrugging their shoulders at it is also stunning, and I think speaks to Mark's larger points.
But wouldn't that require coordination of GOP leaders in those states too, at the state
Clearly
level?
happened.
Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, each state is a little different in how they select electors and how they certify the vote for a presidential election. But the state that I'm most familiar with, Idaho, the Republican electors used to meet, in December after the election. It was very much a ministerial activity. It was almost a ceremonial activity. The Secretary of State had presented the canvassed vote. Every county had submitted their affidavits to the effect that the vote was such and such in their county, and they certified it and sent their electoral votes off to Washington, D.C. The fact that somebody in Arizona and Michigan and Nevada tried to short circuit that process to substitute the real outcome for an outcome that they wanted to have be true is really pretty stunning. I suspect some of those folks are in pretty serious legal jeopardy for interfering with a federal election in that way, or attempting to interfere with it in that way.
Well, is that why Mike Pence? I'm just realizing he had this when he was that night. After the raid of the Capitol, they did go back in to count, to do the ministerial process, and I remember Mike Pence had this long kind of like diatribe that he had to talk to some kind of adjudicator or minister, like some official of the Senate, to clarify the electors that will be counted. Is that why he had to do that? Because there were fake electorates being pushed?
I can't answer that. I don't know. I'm not steeped enough in the details to know why he did that. But clearly, he was under tremendous pressure to do something to stop the certification of the vote. And one of the questions I keep running around in my mind is what did these guys think was going to happen if they were able to stop the certification of the vote? The 147, I think it was, members of the House who launched protests against various electoral counts in various states, or what, 9 members of the Senate or 7 members of the Senate, I think, Ted Cruz among them, Josh Hawley, who objected to the count or the electoral counts in several states. What were they attempting to do? I mean, I think Cruz had this crazy idea that he was going to create an electoral commission that was going to sort all of this out between the time that the vote was supposed to be certified and the next president would be sworn into office. But I'm not sure what they were trying to do. They were obviously sowing misinformation and discord, trying, I guess, to throw anything up against the wall that might conceivably stick in order to have their side prevail.
And I think we forget sometimes, Mark, that these electors are people. I mean, people actually, and they, and the tradition is, and one could argue the legal requirement is that they cast their vote at the way the state told them to cast it.
Right.
But there have been cases where there have been rogue electors who have done otherwise. It hasn't made a difference in the past, but it's happened.
It has.
And so, the whole question of the Electoral College has long been, it's time for it to go. Long overdue for it to go, but that was this, as this information starts to seep out, it's just more and more alarming.
So then, is it true that a state legislature can change the rules for how their electorates are determined and
there are states where it's not winner take all.
Yeah.
And that's decided by the legislatures.
And I'm asking that question because this is, again, where I get worried about our democracy dying. How does a democracy die? Well, if we have states and state legislators that are willing to be completely dishonest and create a fake group of electors, it's mind blowing that was even happening and how they kind of came up with this. So if they're willing to do that and essentially lie and do something completely fake, because maybe they believe in, the ends are justifying these dishonest means. We talked about that last time, that one of the, I guess our postulate is that one of the first steps for a death of a democracy is the political leaders are willing to dismantle the institutions that protect the democracy or maintain its integrity.
I think that's very well said. And that's exactly the danger. And I think that's what some people are concerned about with regard to the next presidential election, that the system will be, between now and then, will be structured in some key states to allow just the kind of shenanigans that you were describing, Gary, to actually take place, and to do it under the guise of it being legal, in the sense that there is authority granted to certain officials essentially to rig the vote. And what's more undemocratic, small d democratic, than that, to overturn the expressed will of the people in the interest of breaking faith with them in terms of how they're willing to express themselves. So yeah, that is a real danger, and people are raising that concern now with the way election laws have been changed in places like Georgia. and they've tried to do it in Arizona. And I suspect you're going to only see more of it between now and 2024.
Gary, can I ask
officials
can I ask Mark a question that I'd like to? So, Mark, Edmund Burke is often misquoted as having said, "Evil triumphs when good men do nothing." He never said that, but he said something far more articulate and complicated. But what should people of good faith and who are watching, are paying attention, what should they do? What should all of us be doing at this point?
Well, that is the ultimate good question. I think two or three things specifically. Number one, pay attention to local politics. Pay attention to your school board election. Pay attention to your city council election. Get involved. Know who the candidates are. Understand who's backing them. Why are they running? Evaluate their bona fides as to, how serious they are. On a scale that says we want to support people, regardless of their political party, who support the basic structures and institutions of democracy. So start at the local level, which is the most accessible for most of us. Congress seems very foreign most of the time to most of us. Most people don't know their member of Congress. Probably lots of people couldn't even name them. So start locally and concentrate on those questions. There's no substitute for it. And Roger was right when he earlier said the people who need to do this the most are the least likely to do it. Educate yourself. It's not as though we're living in an age where there isn't a vast amount of information literally available at the click of your index finger. You have to be smart enough to sort through that stuff to find out what is credible, what is real, what is not being fabricated at your expense, that's not being created as a matter of propaganda to have you think one way or the other. But you've got to educate yourself, and it takes work. It takes real work to dig through all the crap that's out there in the internet, on Facebook, and all these social media platforms, and get something approximating the truth. There's a vast amount of literature that's being produced about this very question, how democracies die. I just started reading a couple of days ago a new book about how the 2020 election was not stolen, basically.
Right.
The fact that local election officials in these states we've already alluded to would not go along with a lot of these shenanigans. Trump's famous call to the Secretary of State in Georgia saying, "Find me 11,000 votes." And people were unwilling to do that, even though they were Republican conservative backers of his. They were unwilling to break the rules. So there's lots of information out there about how that came very close to happening. In the back of this book, I think the name of it is The Steal That Didn't Happen, or something like that. Mark Bowden is one of the authors. They actually list in the appendix of the book all of the court cases that were brought by Trump and his supporters seeking to find some irregularity at some level with the election. So that level of information is out there for people to look at, to examine, to talk to their friends and neighbors about, not accept my word for it or Sean Hannity's, but go find it yourself and look for it. So those are two. I mean, they sound very basic, but it's kind of the building blocks of civic engagement. Know what's going on at the local level and educate yourself.
Yeah, and I think if you're in those states, and any of our states, not just those states, like Arizona is, kind of primed for 2024. So is Georgia. If you're in those states, you should be paying very, very close attention to GOP candidates and whether those candidates are willing to live in an alternative reality and therefore willing to put forth laws that allow for fake electorates to be produced, right? I mean, the Republicans in those states are attempting to create these weird laws, and making them reality in order to undermine our institutions. Roger.
I just one quick note. I just one of the most astonishing moments in fairly recent American history is the 2000 election, when I think we forget that it's not particularly uncommon for the winner of the popular vote in presidential elections to not become president. I think it's 5 times that it's happened where the Electoral College has overridden the popular vote. But Al Gore had probably the best case ever to, and of course it was all about Florida, and ultimately it was very hard to watch. But at the right moment, at the right time, for the sake of the country, you can say what you want about Al Gore, but he said, "Okay, enough's enough. I'm,
He did.
this really sucks, but I'm done now." Compare that to the circumstances that we see today, and you see that's all you really need to do to weigh out one circumstance versus the other, and how one approach versus another.
So as we kind of answer this question, or dive into how democracy dies, it's undermining institutions either through complete and utter illogical moves, illogical steps, like lying and creating, fake ballots or fake electors. But I think the other thing that is really clear to me too, and you said this in the beginning of our episode, Roger, Mark, and that is violence. And I'm not sure where violence will lead except to death, and people quitting, getting out of politics. But it is part of the reality we're facing, is it not? And potentially, again, if we go into 2024, try not to be an alarmist here, but if we're in 24, we have Trump running again, which all indicator lights are on that will happen with the GOP. They've selected him. He's running, and again loses. Then we have these mechanisms that have already been kind of tested out, right? Where is the GOP going to send fake electorates? Are they going to use violence against, Democrats or whoever they want to? And then what could a 2.0 of January 6th? What could that? And I'm asking you to speculate, and it's okay to be kind of catastrophic, but I want to hear from both of you. What could a 2024 post-election, if Trump legitimately loses, what could we potentially see?
I think you could see a range of things happen, all the way from some of these armed militia groups showing up at state capitals, interfering, stopping the certification of the electoral vote in specific states, threatening, intimidating local officials, election officials, to not carry out their sworn duties. I think that's one possible scenario. I think another scenario is that you do have what seems to be a legal process where rules have been changed in particular states that allow, essentially 11th hour interference with the certification of elections, with a local election official in Detroit or Philadelphia being replaced at the last minute by somebody who will do something that a high-ranking official wants them to do, as opposed to what the votes indicate they should be doing. I think that's probably more likely than the first scenario I sketched out. The other thing I think that is likely or potentially possible is that you have an election that is so muddled, the outcome is so contested, that a vast majority of Americans throw up their hands in despair, that the system has broken down, that they've lost all faith in the fact that a free and fair election can take place in the country anymore. And who knows what happens at that point? Does the person who commands the most, overweight white guys in camouflage prevail? Or do you have, somebody else step in and say, no, we're not going to go that direction? What role will the courts play, and will people accept the verdicts of courts ruling on a contested election? I think all of those things in various degrees of likelihood are indeed possible, and maybe any number of other alternatives as well.
I think that
What is almost not possible, it seems to me, is that you have an election where the vast majority of Americans say, okay, I accept the outcome of that election.
I agree with that as well. I think the most likely scenario is something that has the sniff of legitimacy, and I think that's what's being put into motion now. And I don't want to use the term conspiracy because it's these things are hard to manage at that level, but I do think there is a clear effort to give the sniff of legitimacy to the outcomes that certain people want to see happen. And that is how democracy ultimately likely dies. Can there be pockets of violence? Of course there can. There have been in our own US Capitol building. So, it's not as if that can never happen, but it's more likely that the other scenario, the latter scenarios that Mark discusses are how it plays out. And at some point, you people for a period of time you can argue it's been happening for some time, just disengage. Okay, I can't do this anymore. And then it sort of becomes a little more tribal.
Right. It does. And I think that the other thing that I've been kind of contemplating is what happens even beyond that period of time, because there is a whole new generation that's coming up, right, that will be inheriting kind of this mess that an older generation has kind of left us with. And so I tend to, I probably do feel a bit more hopeful. I'm not naive to think that we could see some serious problems in the next election and even after that. But I wonder about what's possible with newer generations. I mean, I hate to sound morbid, but the truth is, demographically, the baby boomer group is the largest population group within America, but the baby boomer population will also die out almost all at once within the 10 to 20 year period. And then what do you have left? It's Generation X and below. And so what are your thoughts about kind of, let's say that we do see some serious disruption in the next election and even thereafter for one or two cycles? Is there I'm hopeful. I'll say I'm hopeful that there's some recovery afterwards, but what are your thoughts?
Well, my sweet wife, who Roger knows, teaches at the university level, and she regularly reminds me that I am too pessimistic about things because she sees younger people, and she teaches in a public administration program. So she is dealing with young people who want to devote at some level their careers to working in the public sector, working in government at some level. And she thinks they're much more engaged, optimistic, willing to do the hard work of being a citizen than many of us would give them credit for. I think that's the case with my own two sons who, are late 30s. So, I have to temper some of my pessimism with the anecdotal, at least, evidence that there is a cadre of really engaged young people out there who do understand, that a lot's riding on getting this right, that may be more concerned about some of the big issues that confront society, income inequality and climate change and some of those kinds of things, that they think our generation is totally screwed up and that they're going to have to come in and pick up the pieces. I hope that's true. I really, really hope that's true. Just parenthetically, Gary, I would add that I think it's an astounding factoid that the two political leaders of the two political parties in the country are 80-year-old white guys.
I know.
Come on.
Yeah.
That generation, frankly, has to step off the stage sooner rather than later. The Democratic leadership in the Congress is, completely geriatric. They need to get some of these new, bright, engaged, thoughtful people advanced up the leadership ranks so that we do have a new generation of people with fresh ideas and fresh perspective and more energy, frankly, not wedded to some of the old ways, calling the shots.
Roger.
Well, I don't think our kids can do any worse than we boomers have done of late. I mean, can they possibly
Pretty low bar.
can they pull it back? I don't know. But we're not leaving a great legacy. And my kids are like Mark's, actively engaged, and I don't know if they're how representative they are. The students I teach at Gonzaga are certainly impressive, and I don't worry about that. Those folks, even the community college students I teach, by and large, yeah, they're gonna be active, and they're learning things, and that's going to be helpful. I just, how bad does it get in the short term? It's pretty scary just right now.
Right.
We just had a year ago, we had our capital invaded by our own people.
Right.
Right. I can't even, you can't make that stuff up. So it's not as if, we're envisioning some sort of horrific future. We're looking at a horrific recent past, and it's still with us.
Horrific recent past that there's a lot of effort to whitewash what happened. Just earlier today, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich, is on Fox News this morning saying that people who are investigating the January 6th riot at the Capitol, attack on the Capitol, are likely to face prison for the fact that they are conducting this investigation when Republicans take control of the House and the Senate again after the next election. It's wild, unhinged rhetoric from a man who's done more than almost anybody else I can think of to erode the American political system. But that's a level of craziness that is, passes for conventional thought among a lot of people on the conservative right.
Authoritarianism.
The other thing that I'll just throw out here that I think is fundamental to everything we've talked about is, and we've all suggested it, is the level of faith in our main institutions, which is, and you, Mark, you just mentioned it, but do we trust the Supreme Court? Do we trust the branches of government? I can only speak for myself. Not a lot right now. When the Supreme Court takes away the insurance of the Voter Rights Act because, oh, everything's fine now. That doesn't encourage my trust in the Supreme Court. And so I personally worry about the legitimacy and the functionality of our main branches of federal government. And and you can extend that into the states and the local. So you can understand why people would start to get, throw up their hands like, okay.
Yeah. Which may be one of the biggest dangers of all, that people just become so disillusioned that they don't figure that the fight is worth having any longer. And the fight, by the fight, I mean the commitment to being engaged, is no longer seems relevant, no longer seems possible, that they just become discouraged and turn it off. That seems like a really dangerous situation to me, and one that's not at all unlikely given all that's going on.
And it's the worst of all potential outcomes, because that ensures the continued degradation that we're worried about. The only protection is good people, thoughtful people staying engaged, young people getting involved, fighting the good fight, causing good trouble. That's what has to happen here. That's, and so this is why Mark does what he does, other than he's getting rich off these books he's writing. But, this is to a large degree what I do, why I think this is important. I don't care if it's, 100 people, but if somebody out of that 100 people who hears what we're having to say, it triggers something in them to do something constructive, great. It's been worth all the time. And if we can start to multiply that even a little bit, it's astonishing to me how much difference individual people still can have if they will just try.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a thank you for sharing, about your kids and your kind of thoughts about the future. I'm in a position where I'm raising the Generation Z and Gen Alphas, so I've got a pretty young crew, and I'll tell you so just imagine what they've witnessed with Donald Trump. And one of the comments was actually earlier from my wife Liliana, who said our kids see no need for a president, and the reason for that is because they saw very clearly, on their own, without anyone telling them one way or the other, that these kids can just watch him, and they realize this is a joke. So not only do I think that my kids' generations are going to come into the political world with very, very different thoughts and ideas than we have, they very well could say, wait a minute, we're fine with, the GOP and some of the boomers maybe kind of unraveled and destroyed many of these institutions. We're going to rebuild them, but they're going to look really different. I'm not saying that they're going to say we don't need a president anymore, but I'm just trying to drive home the point that they will have witnessed something that, from their perspective, that we can't even comprehend. The way that Donald Trump acted, behaved, treated people, the way that many people responded to the pandemic. To my kids, it's ludicrous, right? These are smart, intelligent kids. It's a logical path forward of how you deal with the pandemic. Vaccines make sense, and yet they're seeing complete idiocy. And so when I think about them and that very young generation, those Z's and Alphas, I wouldn't be surprised if they are willing, and if they'll have to, in some ways, kind of redesign our institutions for a new future. Because we tore them apart.
Well, there's one line of argument that says that out of this chaos will come something better. I hope that's true, and I hope your kids, Gary, and so many others of that generation are willing to keep investing in the idea that there's something here that can be built upon or rebuilt. Um, you know, Probably not a popular thing to say in some circles, but the Constitution is what, 160 plus, 260 plus years old, and it's only been amended, what, 26 times or 27 times. Um, it's archaic in many ways. There needs to be, some rethinking of the way the government is structured so it works better to solve problems and address what people are really concerned about. So maybe a new generation will take that cause up, and there will be a fresh thinking about what America can be, should be.
So yeah, a lot of my motivation for this show, it really is. I know that when my kids are older, they'll watch these, right? And I like so we're talking to you guys if you're watching in the future, and kind of listening to what we've experienced. So, gentlemen, as we wrap up, I think a few requests that I've seen, coming through my email for our show is if you're willing, and I don't know what your appetite is for this, but there are some action oriented audience members. I call them buttercups, and they'd like to hear in our future shows what, because we're in 22, we're headed against midterms, and is that right? We will be we'll be doing so. I'm getting a request that we also have some topics, or we spend a little bit of time on our Sunday program to outline what we know is happening currently, for just kind of education. And I don't want to burden any of us, like, to try to understand in any too much detail or depth about current events with politics. But one of the questions is, we've heard from you, where we want to do something, we want to be proactive, we're right up against midterms. What do we do? What can we learn? Is that interesting, or is that too labor intensive?
Well, I think it's the building block of civic engagement to think about the next election, to study the candidates that you have an opportunity to vote for or to be engaged with, to figure out if there's a campaign that you might actually want to help a candidate out with. It's the building block of civic engagement. So sure, I love that stuff. It's the bread and butter of politics.
Mark won't be doing any extra work because he's already doing all this, and I will take my little piece.
Thank you. And I think a specific request is that is the word bipartisan, in our approach, that it's more about we identify those candidates who are willing to dismantle our democracy versus, I think we're okay talking about, debating policy, but I think the bigger concern from our audience is, what candidates do we know are coming forth in where that we may make a difference in not voting for, or not, or trying to subvert, because we know that they're actively part of this effort, this Trumpian effort.
Well, I think so. What I think is, rather than I threw this out, rather than talking about specific candidates, I think it's important to talk about, how do you engage in the political system? How do you learn about what candidates are really thinking? How do you participate before you go to the voting booth? And why? And what's the process? And how do you do that? And why? Mark this is part of Mark's expertise, and I think it really gets to the core of the all of the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't know. I'm long distance from the classroom anymore, but I don't know whether that's even discussed in high school or college classes. How do you engage in the political process beyond, showing up and marking your ballot? And there's a lot of different ways to do it, and some of them can be absolutely stimulating and lots of fun and very rewarding. But you have to be willing to, roll up your sleeves, spend a little time and effort. Um, some of the enduring relationships I've had in my life came about as a result of working with people on political campaigns. You find some really wonderful and make some really wonderful associations. So I think it's a great way to talk about how to, in your own sphere of influence, try to have some influence and steer things in the direction you think they should be going.
So,
The
yeah,
about the classroom, more and more, and we'll see how this all turns out, but more and more, certainly public secondary school teachers are terrified to talk about anything that approaches politics, whether it's, talking about the system. I mean, we can't even talk about certain parts of our history without getting ourselves in trouble. And it's, to a lesser degree, it's true in some of the public um higher education institutions. It's not a problem at Gonzaga because Gonzaga is what it is, and there are other universities where it's not a problem. But there is increasingly a muting of what teachers can even talk about inside their classrooms. So that's part of the problem, Mark, is it's
Yeah.
not really happening there like it used to.
so we have a last question here, and I think we've addressed this, but I think it'd be great, Mark, if you kind of wanted to give us your parting thoughts on what we think of today as voting rights. Is voting a right versus a privilege? And then Roger, anything you'd add, and we'll end it there.
Well, I think voting is a right and it's also a privilege. It should be viewed as both, I think, in a democratic system. A privilege to be able to select candidates that you support, to find ways to support them, to vote for them, to work on their campaigns, to champion the causes that you want to champion. So I think that's a privilege. But it's also a right because uh, our system, at least since what, Roger, the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, it has been part of the idea that anyone who is an American citizen has a right to vote. Now, we had a long period, as Roger correctly pointed out earlier, when that was not the case, where women didn't have the right to vote, when most African Americans, particularly in the South, didn't have the right to vote, or were prevented from voting because the barriers constructed toward voting were so high that they couldn't get over them. But it is a right. It is a right that goes along with being an American citizen, and it's a responsibility as well. And to see it as all three of those things, a right, a responsibility, and a privilege, seems to me to be at the cornerstone of how we ought to think about voting. Now, there's lots of ways to cut and slice what's being talked about now in terms of different mechanisms to ensure or limit people's right to vote. But the fundamental idea that if you're qualified by age, by the fact that you've lived in a particular geographic in location for a specified period of time, that you meet the requirements that are outlined by law, then you should be able to vote, and you shouldn't have artificial barriers constructed by limiting polling places, limiting the hours that voting is going to take place, trying to limit the use of absentee ballots or mail-in ballots, and not because there is any real threat of fraud associated with the use of those techniques to vote, but simply because it makes it more difficult for certain people in our society to vote. So yeah, I think it's a right, a responsibility, and a privilege.
What Mark said.
What Mark said, I agree. Ditto that. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We are gaining, I've noticed more and more audience members, more and more viewers. So we're going to keep this going. I'm loving this new format, and it's very helpful for me to know that we have a show scheduled. So so I'm not trying to, figure it out last minute. So I've appreciated that. Roger and Mark, I love talking with each of you each Sunday, and really appreciate the time that you are willing to give us.
Thank you, Gary. It's been great fun for me. A lot of fun to be with Roger. I just say you may need to get better guests eventually, though. So
well, we may do that, but I think those guests would want to be want the three of us there too. So we'll become three co-hosts together with a few new guests, but I think that'll happen probably this semester. So.
Great.
With that said, we'll just say good night, everybody, and hope you have a great week. Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.